One way to try to answer this question is to think about the infectious diseases more broadly over the past, let's say, a century and a half. And if we look at the past century and a half, we see that the attention given to infectious diseases and the narratives we tell about infectious diseases, broadly speaking, have changed considerably over this time frame. Now, when Merle and I looked at this, we actually found parallel changes. So changes in academic research were parallel, happened at the same time as changes in, let's say, the representation of infectious diseases in media or popular culture. And here I'm talking about anything from news to literature and film and so on. The end point of all of this is the world in which we live today. So 2020, 2021, and what you can see here, we have lots and lots of infectious diseases around the world, some emerging, some re-emerging, and so on and so on. And of course, plague also appears here on the bottom right. So we're going to focus here on the Justinianic plague specifically. And maybe a good place to start would be the graph, the weird-looking graph on the left there. This graph represents research on the Justinianic plague from the 17th century onwards. The way to read this is from bottom to top. You can see here on the left side of the slide the years, so from 1685 all the way till 2020 or so. Each of these blue dots is a research output, so a book or an article. The size of the blue dot corresponds to how many other articles on the Justinianic plague cite that specific article. And the black lines are connections. It's supposed to be interactive, but obviously here I can't have it interactive in this PowerPoint. So you'll have to believe me on that. But to put things in context, so the first wave of attention to the Justinianic plague really happens in this rectangle, the lower red rectangle. And this is at the turn of the 20th century. The context then is the bubonic plague pandemic that happens at the turn of the 20th century. This is also when the three plague pandemics that we started with are defined. So this turn of the 20th century pandemic becomes the third pandemic during the pandemic itself. So once that happens, there's quite a lot of attention given to historical pandemics, previous plague pandemics, such as the Justinianic plague. But as we move from that into the mid-20th century, the interwar period specifically, narratives then begin to believe that humanity has either defeated infectious diseases or is going to defeat infectious diseases shortly. So they're actually not that big of a deal. And what we see is that plague's role within research is minimized. So there's much less attention given to plague and infectious diseases more broadly. Now, this narrative really collapses in the late 20th century, mostly as a result of two separate developments. One is the failure of humanity to eradicate malaria. This was part of a global attempt to eradicate malaria worldwide. It didn't really work. So that's one issue. So humanity could not defeat malaria. And the other issue is the onset of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s specifically. And together, both of these trigger another wave of attention to infectious diseases. This is the wave of attention we're currently living in. And that also results eventually in the resurgence of Justinianic plague scholarship right at the end of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And here we get a lot of things that we associate with infectious diseases. So the fear and the dread that we're used to think about when we talk about infectious diseases, even before COVID, the presence in the media of infectious diseases, and we'll see that in the next slide, and the different types of popular culture, anything from film to games, discuss infectious disease. Now to think about this would be through this slide. This graph shows us the results of searches, of a search in Web of Science, which is a big scholarly database in the sciences. So what this shows us is how many articles per year, again, the years on the x-axis over here, were published with infectious diseases, that were published on infectious diseases of some sort as a keyword. If we look in the 1990s, we see that somewhere around, I guess, 1,000 maybe or so articles were published every year. If we move forward, fast forward like 30 years or so, we see that much, much more. So almost 10 times as much. Like about 11,000 articles in 2019 focused on infectious diseases. And of course, this trend happens in parallel with various fiction works of fiction, such as the movie Outbreak, which some of you may have watched, and real-world events, so such as the SARS epidemic, the Ebola outbreaks in Congo, and so on. And obviously, COVID is probably going to change this graph quite a bit. So the point here is that because of the way we think about infectious diseases in this context, in our 2021 context, we expect that plague, plague, would or really must have a drastic effect. And we assume that it must have caused mass death, even if the evidence for that mass death is lacking or ambiguous. Put things differently, discourse on the Justinianic plague really trumps evidence, is more important than the evidence. I'll give a couple of examples. One example is this map over here that was published a couple of years ago in a science. All the colored areas here on this map are areas where we know, or we think we know, plague happened in late antiquity. You can see different names and names of places and the times in which a plague reached those areas. Now, this looks pretty impressive. I mean, plague seems to have covered the Mediterranean, but once we move and zoom in to many of these different episodes or outbreaks or specific cases, and here we'll take Sicily in 542 as an example, we'll see that the evidence is not that robust. So the only evidence we have for plague in Sicily in 542, the only reason why Sicily here is colored in like blue color is this inscription. You can read the translation of that inscription here on the left, but I can say already that if you read it, you'll see that there is no cause of death listed, there's no specific year listed there, there's no reference to the extent of plague within the island, within Sicily, and there's no association with plague whatsoever. So why is Sicily colored? So to make a long story short, a couple of decades ago, one scholar suggested that this tombstone might be related to plague, and scholars citing each other essentially have transitioned from that being a possibility into that being fact. And the end result of that process is coloring Sicily on this map over here. Another example, so we can look at both these images on the top here. The left image, on the top left image, is an image from a video game representing Constantinople in the 6th century in the context of plague. So you have the pile of corpses. But maybe one of the most prominent things on that image is the big rat on the right-hand side of the slide. The top right image is the cover page of the Lancet Infectious Diseases, which is a prestigious journal in medicine. This specific cover image was in the issue that included the article that proved that the Justinianic plague was indeed caused by Yersinia pestis using molecular evidence. But again, if we look on the cover page, what we see is the undead Justinian here, pretty prominently, and we see these 3 rats around him. Now, rats were not part of the article, were not even mentioned in the article within that journal issue. What the article did discuss was DNA, which you may be able to see right here. It's definitely not as prominent as the big rats over here. So rats are we clearly associate rats with plague. Rats are kind of assume that rats would be a big deal in plague. But were they? If we take all the rat bones that we have found, and people have been discussing rat bones for about a century at this point, if we take all the rat bones we know of that were found in archaeological excavations all around the Mediterranean and in Europe between the years 1 and 1500, so 1500 years, that covers both the Justinianic plague and the Black Death, the result we get is this map over here. So each of these black markers, I'm not sure if you can see the details there, but each of them is shaped, has a rat shape. And each of those corresponds to one or more rat bones that were found in excavations in that specific area. If we look at the eastern part of the Mediterranean, so this area, the area of the Roman Empire in the 6th century, we see that there actually aren't that many rat bones over there. Now, if we compare rat bones between the Justinianic plague and the Black Death, we have much more rat bones for the Black Death. But even there, scholars have argued, as this article over here shows on the lower right, that there simply aren't enough rats to sustain a pandemic at the size of the Black Death. So we could take the same argument and make it even stronger for the Justinianic plague. So regardless of there being not enough rats, simply not enough rats or not enough archaeological evidence for rats, we still associate plague with rats and all these, again, fictional figures and fictional art and figures. And by that, I will bring things back to Merle to start wrapping things up.
Thanks, Lee. Okay, so to get us toward the end, I'm going to draw some connections, look at some things that have shown up over the last year in terms of COVID and its connections to the Justinianic Plague and pandemics more broadly. This is something that Lee and I have spent a lot of time thinking about and working through as we've been doing this and talking to guests on our podcast who work on various diseases and how this has kind of shaped their work and our work and what's kind of shown up if you slice down the data of what people were saying, say the first couple of months and then building from there. So the first thing to point out is as Lee did in the opening slide, as you guys have all probably seen, you now get giant charts of what's the most deadly pandemic in history, right? So that pandemics are reduced to these death counts, as you see here. We've circled the plague of Justinian and COVID on this one here. I guess our great contribution to this entire thing is this note right below says this is under dispute. So that's kind of our contribution to giant charts, is we get a footnote saying this is debatable. But you also get obviously greater connections to plague in general, right? Plague is made into kind of everything. It's a catch-all now. Here's a tweet obviously from Donald Trump. And then as well, as people have gotten bubonic plague, which they still do to this day, both in the Western United States and more frequently in China, but we're talking a handful of cases generally speaking. The connection, as Lee pointed out in the previous couple of slides, between plague, what's happening today, and the Black Death is in every one of these popular media articles. Now, again, as someone who works on plague, I can say, well, you know, they're just getting it wrong. But what it shows is the strength of this discussion in the general narrative of how we think about these things. The second thing that